Hello. So this week we had a bunch of readings to do on um, LGBT health disparities in general, but specifically on identity formation and various models for that, as well as various models or variations on the ecological model of health. So one of the first things was chapter 1 from one of my favorites. And that chapter by Mickey Eliason and Robert Shope talks about models that range from the way back, really pathologizing models of LGBT identity formation up through more current models. One thing that I was dismayed to see is that the vast majority really don't accommodate non-monosexual identity development other than Fox from 1995. I have an interlibrary loan request out for that book because I do want to see how that looks, because I just want to see it. And I do hope that it's not going to be quite as linear as it sounds, but they were only giving a very brief just list of the stages. So, but if that is intended to be taken as a sequential series, then that kind of it sort of privileges opposite sex attraction as coming before first same sex attraction, which then comes before coming out to yourself and then coming out to others. Videon Casas model is apparently one of the most popular, and probably in part because it actually allows for people to be messy, because people are messy. We like making models that try to make things and people seem like they make sense, but in general, people do not, in fact, make a whole lot of logical sense or fit nicely into categories and stages of things. So while her model still has this progression of identity confusion, identity comparison, identity tolerance, identity acceptance, identity pride, and then identity synthesis, it acknowledges that you might not finish all the tasks of one stage before moving on to another. You might then go back at some point. And so while it does sort of have this progressive building quality to it, it's not rigid, which I think is appealing. And that model also sort of ends up creating a template for how Eliason and Shope then proceed to talk about the commonalities across these models, where first you have to realize you're different than the dominant society expects you to be, figure out what that is, and identify it to yourself. At some point, identify that to others, and so on and so forth, and making community connections, which then leads nicely into the whole social ecological model, which I've seen so many different variations of it at this point. I think I'd actually love to see an actual progression of, okay, this was the very first, and then somebody did this and somebody did that. Sometimes it's circles, sometimes it's ovals. But a few of our readings talked about different variations on it, which reminded me, speaking of Eliason and Fogel's 2015 piece on using a minority stress-infused ecological model looking at sexual minority women and overweight and obesity. So it's a really useful model because clearly people find it very easy to adapt so that you can look at things affecting the individual, their nearest community, bigger community, society at large, and Barrel's model, for example, took as its widest piece the stage of the HIV epidemic, and what stage that is at and how that impacts each level down. I liked how Barrel in particular looked at the way that we often focus so much of our efforts on, our society is just so individually focused that even if we recognize that all these other levels exist, we still focus our interventions on the individual. And that's great. The individual needs interventions. The individual is who is actually getting sick or injured or whatever other thing we're trying to prevent. But if we miss out on all the things at the community level, network level, societal, policy, etc. levels, then we're missing out on other things we could be doing that might actually have a bigger effect on more individuals. And, being public health, we're looking at more than just individuals. Sell's article in Press kind of tied all this together, looking at identity formation. Well, not a sort of identity formation, but how we identify people as being sexual minorities, and then what that means, and how we can use our understanding of that to mitigate disparities. Looking, for example, at the different risks that exist based on sexual attraction, behavior, identity, and then across all of those categories, and then looking at that with regard to the ecological model as well. Something I'd really like to try at some point is to take that ecological model with that in mind and look at two different individuals and how their risk factors map out comparatively, because I think that could be useful not only for looking at where the disparities are, but also not looking to create separate interventions for somebody who fits this generic ecological model and somebody who fits this specific, whether it's a sexual minority, gender minority, racial minority, in this other ecological model, but more how can we come up with things that are inclusive and that break down some of the disparities in access, disparities in whatever other factors that we find that are causing disparities in health outcomes. So I see I've already gone way, way over the 1 to 2 minutes, which, if I remember from last quarter, is not etched in stone, but I don't want to ramble on too long. But those are some of my thoughts on the readings from this week, and which I hope sort of address some of the questions that were suggested in the reading notes. I guess that's it for now. I will see you next week. Bye.